Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sunday Morning Live. It's good to be with you on this Sunday morning in March. I hope all of you remembered to move your clocks an hour forward. I think quite a number of folks will probably tune in to see this an hour from now, but we hope they get a chance to see it and view it. We're in a wonderful passage in the book of Galatians chapter 4. We're going to start in verse 8 today and go all the way through the end of the chapter. At least that's the plan, to get through the end of chapter 4. There's a lot to cover, so we're gonna dive in pretty quickly here. But again, welcome to Sunday Morning Live. Today's message is entitled "Children of Promise," and that's what you and I are. We are children of promise. Isaac was a child of promise. He was the promised one from God himself, and God delivered on that promise. And that really grew Abraham's faith and enabled him to actually put Isaac on an altar to sacrifice him. If God could bring Isaac into the world in the way that he did, he could also bring him back to life. That was the faith of Abraham, and that's the faith of you and me as well. We believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. So that's our faith, and that faith brings us new birth into the family of God, and we become children of promise. So last week, we looked at Galatians 3, the end of chapter 3, all the way through the first 7 verses. And we ended that with this contrast. We were once enslaved under the elementary principal forces of this world. That's how we lived before we came to know Jesus Christ. But then when faith came, we were given full rights of sons. We were adopted into the family of God, and we received adoption to sonship. And it's by the Spirit of God who now lives in us that we cry out, Abba, Father, and we make claim to our inheritance as children of God. So we're no longer slaves, but God's children. And since we are his children, God has also made us his heirs. So we were once slaves to sin and death. Now we are children of God. When we were slaves to sin and death, we were bound up by the elementary forces of the world. So that's what moved us. That's what controlled us. That's what motivated us in life. But now we are children of God with the Spirit of God living in us, and we are to be led by the Spirit of God. That's the contrast. And so we need to know what we once were and what we are now. Children of God, children of promise. So with that as a backdrop, let's dive into our passage for the day. Starting in verse 8. Formerly, Paul writes, when you did not know God. So that's important. When we were slaves to sin and death, we did not know God. God was unfamiliar to us. We had some concepts of God, but they were not based on truth. They were based on lies. They were based on our own understanding. They were formed through the prism or through the filter of sin and death. And so when we're using sin to try to come up with a proper understanding of God, we're going to miss the mark every single time. So we did not know God. We had an understanding that he existed, but what he was like, we had no earthly idea. So when we did not know God, we were slaves to those who by nature are not God's. So we were slaves to the things of this world, and we put a lot of stock in those things. We think they're important. Money is a big thing that we put a lot of stock into. We think money is going to bring us happiness, and as Jesus said, you can't worship God and money at the same time. So money is one of those false gods of this world. And there's a lot of people that are enslaved to money or enslaved by their love of money. So we were slaves to those who by nature are not God's. But now that you know God, and there's the contrast. When you were a slave to the things of this world, you did not know God, but now as a child of God, you do know God. And that's a huge difference. And God has deposited the knowledge of himself into your heart. He has written the knowledge of himself in your minds and on your hearts. He's etched it there by the Spirit of God. So now you know God. And then here's the cool thing, or rather are known by God. How about that? You are known by God. God knows you. He knows all about you. He knows your quirks. He knows your habits. He knows your thoughts. He knows what motivates you. He knows what's going on inside of you at any given moment. He knows you. And that's a positive thing. That is a very comforting thing, that there's somebody out there that knows me better than I even know myself. He knows all the deep concerns and needs of my heart. So we are known by God. So he's saying, now that you know God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? What are those weak and miserable forces? Those things that held you as slaves before you knew God. Those elemental spiritual forces of the world. Now, that could be the law of God. That could be religion, all the religious rituals, the rules, and the regulations. Paul talks about this in the book of Colossians as well. He says, why do you keep returning to those elemental forces? Those things like do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And as I have said, those things do not work. They do not work in curbing the fleshly desires and those indulgences. Those things don't work. They have an appearance of wisdom, but they don't do the job. They are weak and useless. So it's the law. The law kept people under bondage to sin and death. That's what its purpose was. We see these religious rules and regulations. They do the same thing. We can follow days and months and years and all these different festivals, but they don't touch the heart as well. So he's saying, now that you know God, now that you are known by God, why turn back to those things? Why not embrace who you are as a child of God? Why not capture and really take hold of this fact that you have been adopted into sonship, that you have full rights as a son of God? Why not embrace that and move forward with it? Why turn back? It's like Paul would ask the Israelites coming out of Egypt, why do you want to go back to Egypt? Why do you want to go back under the control of the Egyptians? Why not embrace this freedom, this newfound freedom that you have as a result of God's miraculous power, his miraculous presence to set you free? Why not allow him to take you to the promised land? And that's basically what Paul is saying here. Why go back to those things that kept you enslaved now that you have been set free as a son of God? So, do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? And that's the deal. These things aren't there for freedom. These things, these elementary spiritual forces, these elemental spiritual forces, they aren't there for your freedom. They aren't there for liberty. They are there to enslave you, to hold you in a certain place. Only the Spirit of God can lead you into freedom. So do you want to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. So Paul was frustrated. He was perplexed by this whole situation that was going on in the province of Galatia. I mean, you can imagine. He goes in there, he pours his life out, he tells them about the good news of Jesus Christ. They hear it. He makes sure they've heard the message. They believe, or at least he thinks they've believed. And then he moves on. And then others come behind Paul and say, no, no, no. Paul is right to a point, but if you really want to be a part of the family of God, you need to become like us. You need to become Jewish. You need to become circumcised if you're a male. You need to follow the customs of Moses. And so Paul was worried that he had wasted his efforts on these people in Galatia. And he says that he expresses his frustration. He expresses the fact that he is perplexed by them. And so he says, I plead with you, brothers and sisters, become like me. For I became like you. You did me no wrong. As you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. And even though my illness was a trial to you, you did not treat me with contempt or scorn. They didn't look down at Paul. Why? Because they recognized the message that Paul was bringing to them was a powerful message. Instead, you welcome me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself. Where then is your blessing of me now? So when Paul was with them, they blessed him. They received him. They received his message. They treated him as if he were an angel or if he were Christ himself. And now they were treating him with contempt and scorn. Why? Because they were putting aside his message and grabbing hold of a different message. And as we've already learned, it was not a gospel message. If there was any other message preached other than the one Paul preached, it's not a gospel message at all. And it's going to enslave. It's going to bring harm. It's going to make you act hypocritically. It's going to be something that causes division and confusion and all the things that we've already seen throughout the book of Galatians, of the book of Galatians. So he says, where then is your blessing of me? I can now testify that if you could have done so, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. So we think his illness had something to do with his eyes, and the people in Galatia were so concerned that they would have done anything to try to bring healing to Paul. Now, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? And what is he telling them? That why are you acting foolishly? Why are you acting hypocritically? Why are you trying to perfect yourselves through human effort now rather than going forward by the Spirit? So they didn't like what he was saying to them because it didn't jive with what they were hearing from these other preachers and these other ambassadors of different messages. It says those people are zealous to win you over. And that's important for us to understand. But for no good, what they want is to alienate you from us so that you may have zeal for them. So what these other Judaizers were doing is they were drawing a line in the sand, and they were saying to the people in Galatia, you either stand with Paul or you stand with us. And we're telling you, if you really want to be a part of the people of God, if you really want to be a part of what God's family is all about, then you need to become like us. And so they were listening to that, and the persuasive nature in which that message was being presented to them was drawing them away from the gospel of Jesus Christ. And these Judaizers were doing everything that they can and being powerfully persuasive in their efforts to win these people over to their way of thinking. Now, what they really wanted was to alienate the people in Galatia from the Apostle Paul himself. Now, that's what we need to understand, that there's a lot of different messages that are being promoted, that are being preached out there in the world today. And those that are preaching a different message than the gospel of Jesus Christ, some may be preaching that it's the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, plus water baptism that saves. Some may be preaching the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, plus church membership to be saved. The death, the burial, the resurrection, plus giving of 10% will bring about salvation. Those messages aren't the gospel message. The gospel is the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus, period. If you try to add to it, then you have perverted the message, and it is no longer the gospel message. Now, those who promote those things are very powerful and persuasive in trying to win you over to their way of thinking. They want you to join with them. And in joining with them, you're going to alienate yourself from those who believe the simplicity of the gospel, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. So we need to be careful. And this goes back all the way back to Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, where Paul writes this: Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. So here Paul kind of touches back on that thing. He brings that back into his argument, his discussion here. These people are zealous to win you over. Now, why would you listen to them? Why would you follow what they are putting out? Well, simply this: to please them, so that you can be a part of their inner circle, so that you could be accepted by them. That's why you would follow their way of thinking. So Paul is saying, why would you do that? Why would you turn back to the elemental spiritual forces of this world? It just doesn't make sense. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, how I wish I could be with you now and change my tone, because I am perplexed about you. So it's fine to be zealous as long as the purpose is good. But Paul is saying, I'm going to continue my work in bringing this good news of Jesus to you until Christ is formed in you, so that you can truly have the way of life that Paul has been preaching and promoting, as he talked about in Galatians 2. I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That's the goal of the teaching, for us to realize that Christ lives in us. Excuse me. That's the good news. Christ died. Christ was buried. Christ was raised. Christ ascended. And when we receive him, he sends his spirit to take up residence in us. Christ being formed in us. Christ becoming our way of life. Not the elemental forces of this world. Not the rule of law. Not people pleasing. Simply Christ. Christ is our way of life. And Paul was going to do everything until the people in Galatia really grabbed hold of that message. And they could say, along with Paul, we've been crucified with Christ. We no longer live. It is Christ who lives in us. Now, Paul is going to really give us an illustration to bring this home to us. And he says this in verse 21, "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says?" So what's the deal? These folks are saying, hey, they want to be under the law. Why? Because that's what these Judaizers were teaching them, that you need to put yourself under the law. If you want to be a part of the people of God, then you need to operate out of the law. You need to let the law be your rule of life. You need to be under the law. You need to be motivated by the law. You need to live by the works of the law. So if you want to be under the law, are you aware of what the law says? Obviously not. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. So Paul is going to take us back before the law was even given, some 400 years before the law was given. But he's going to show us a principle in the life of Abraham. So God gave Abraham a promise, and he said that you're going to have a son. Now, Abraham wasn't sure how this was going to take place, as he and Sarah were getting elderly in age, beyond the years of childbearing. So they came up with a plan and devised it and said, we're going to do something to help God along. So Sarah offered Abraham Hagar, the servant woman, and they conceived. Hagar conceived, and she gave birth to Ishmael. Now, Hagar was a slave woman, a slave in the household of Abraham and Sarah. Sarah was the free woman. Now, his son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh. So we, under the law, are trying to make the flesh be on the same level as God's righteousness. We are trying to make the flesh righteous. Well, the flesh isn't going to be righteous. God is never going to declare our fleshly efforts righteous. God is never going to accept them as holy and good. Why? Because they are motivated by the flesh, and the flesh is motivated by sin and death. So that son that Abraham had, Ishmael, was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a divine promise. God brought Isaac into the world because of his faithfulness to his promise to Abraham. Now, these things are being taken figuratively. The women represent two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. So if you want to be under the law, you're going to be a slave to the law. You're going to be a slave to sin and death. There's no freedom there. The things that you want to do, you won't do, and the things you don't want to do, you'll do anyway. That's what your life is going to be like under that old covenant. Now, this is Hagar. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. And that was truth because they did not receive their Messiah. They remained in bondage to sin and death. Jesus Christ was going to bring them freedom. As he said to the Pharisees in John chapter 8, you are slaves to sin. And if you know the truth will set you free. And when the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And they responded, hey, we've never been in bondage or enslaved to anything. Of course, they forgot their history. And Jesus reminded them of that history. But then he said, here's the real truth. You are enslaved to sin. Anyone who sins is a slave to sin. And what is that sin? Unbelief. Unbelief in Jesus Christ. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. God sent Jesus. He came down from the heavenlies. He entered into our world, and he brings freedom to you and me. And when we trust in him, we're born again into the family of God, and we become children of promise. For it is written, be glad, barren woman, you who never bore a child. Shout for joy and cry aloud, you who were never in labor, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. God is going to bring forth his family, and the number that stand within the family of God, it's going to be many. Why? Because that's the promise of God. Now, you brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise. And there's the message, the title of the message. You are a child of promise. Just as Isaac was a child of promise, he came forth into this world when it seemed absolutely impossible. We too were born again into the family of God when it was impossible for us to make that happen. It was impossible for us to bring that about. It took a miracle of God. It took something that came from above, Jesus Christ himself, to make that a possibility. And what seems impossible to us becomes possible in Jesus Christ. So we are children of promise. Now, at that time, the son born according to the flesh persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. So that was the conflict, Ishmael and Isaac. Well, that represents the conflict between the flesh and the Spirit. We're trying to perfect the flesh. God is saying, hey, I've crucified that old man, and I've given you a new life that is by the Spirit from start to finish. Now, it is the same now, but what does Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. So we're not old covenant believers, we're new covenant believers. Men, those that were born of Ishmael are not going to share in the inheritance that was set aside for the children of promise, for Isaac and his bloodline. Well, we're of that spiritually. We are children of promise. We are children of the free woman, and therefore we have an inheritance. And what Paul is saying, don't turn back. Now that you're a child of promise, don't turn back to those elemental forces. That may seem wise to you. That may seem like the right thing to do. And there may be people out there who seem like they have the authority and the expertise to lead you back down that path. But don't listen. Don't follow. Why? Because it is a path that leads back to slavery, not to freedom. God has set you free, and he has caused you to be a child of promise. He has lifted you above the elemental forces of this world, and he has put you under the power and the control of his Spirit. And so go forward being led by the Spirit of God. And it is there that you're going to experience ultimate freedom. There is no freedom in turning back. Don't turn back. As Paul said in his letter to the Philippians, press on. Forget what lies behind. Press on. Know the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in knowing the power of the resurrection, you will experience ultimate freedom in your life. Who are you? Well, you were once a slave to the elemental spiritual forces of the world, but now you are a child of promise, led by the Spirit of God. Well, thanks for joining today. Good to be with you, and hope you enjoy this Sunday, the rest of this Sunday, and go out and live it as a child of promise. Take hold of this new life that you have, this freedom, and enjoy it to the full. And if anybody tries to tempt you to turn back to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, don't listen. They're just trying to claim you as one of their followers, as one of their disciples, and to put a notch in their belt. Well, don't give in to that. Don't try to feed their egos. Stand firm in the simplicity of the gospel and recognize that you are a child of the free woman, a child of promise. Well, God bless. Have a great Sunday. We'll see you next week for another look in Galatians chapter 5, freedom that we have in Christ Jesus. We'll see you then. So long.